It's a fine foggy night tonight, and I doubt if anyone has ever told you of the marvelous fogs we have in Aberdeen.
Eugene.
Bakersfield.
Los Angeles.
San Francisco.
He wasn't giving me my props in Oaktown.
Portland.
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles de California.
San Francisco.
San Francisco.
You gotta find your Irvine.
Irvine?
Hanford.
Eugene.
Seattle.
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 Sacramento.
Fresno.
We're going to Vancouver.
Modesto, California.
San Diego.
Gina.
You know, there might be an opening for a manager in Visalia next spring.
Yakima, right?
Vallejo, California. The V.
I'm gonna count us down so we can use all the good stuff for the okay. 3, 2, 1, and welcome to the Weedweek podcast. I can't believe I did that. You know what I did? I did that when Hannah was on. When Hannah came on, you remember Hannah, the producer?
Hannah's great. I still listen to her podcast. She's got great podcast.
Yeah, and I did that same thing with her. We may keep this. Welcome to Once the Sojourn, Jessie Staniforth. This is my man. You've never met Love.
Hi, Jesse. Good to meet you. Good to meet you.
So for those of you who don't follow, I don't know, cannabis deeply, Jessie was the Canada editor, right? Weedweek Canada editor back in 2018 to 2020. Is that right? Is that it? And
2018.
And we're going to talk a lot about the Native people up in Canada in a minute here, but do you mind if we reminisce for a moment?
Well, please. I want to hear about this connection you all have.
Funny thing, no, the glory days of weed.
Yeah, sure. We can talk about that too.
Because I think that I started up here legally. Legal weed started when I was up here. I guess medicinal was going on in California, and I was a big part of that. But I started here, and I moved back to LA. We got hired by a guy named Alex Halperin, and I feel like I entered into a whole different world of cannabis just because it was like a boom period. What was your experience at that time?
Oh, it was exactly the same up here. Alex and I went to university together, and we had worked on a number of different writing things, different eras. And so when he was doing Weed Week, he called me up and said, Canada's about to legalize nationally, and we're going to need a Weed Week Canada, and I'd like you to do that if you're interested. And I said, sure. At the time, I was, coming off, 20 some years of being straight edge. I wasn't a drug person, alcohol person, and I really wasn't interested in business. So he thought it would be hilarious to throw me into a newsletter about the business of cannabis. And it was an amazing beat because, as you know, I came into it just before things got legal. So, I think I started doing the newsletter about 7 months before we legalized. And so the run up to it, that glorious period when everybody thought money was going to grow on trees, and you can't. It's not as bad as the United States, but we can't export flower out of this country, and yet people, the various different producers, in the lead up to legalization, they had enough infrastructure to produce 150% of the amount of cannabis Canadians could consume. And this is before we even got to legalization. And everybody was still throwing money around. It was a super exciting period right until the needle scratch of legalization. Then there was, nosedive. And, now it's like, I don't even recognize I don't recognize 90% of the players in the cannabis space that I knew when I was doing Weed Week. And the part of that is that I've been working in Indigenous media for a while now. That's what I was doing before I did Weed Week. And so I was able to come back to it. And honestly, there's a lot of nuance in the cannabis space. And if you're not there every day to see what's going on, then you're going to miss it. And I'm not there, so I miss it. And it's crazy.
I was going through some old pictures, just trying to clear out my phone, and I got into the 2018 to that sort of heyday where there was so many products. Every party, because the parties were a part of the job. That's kind of where we got to know each other in Vegas.
Absolutely.
Was that there were so many amazing products, and we do these episodes that were gift guides, holiday gift guides, and they would just load us up with all these imaginative things. I remember this can of butter making machine that I was so in love with, and I was making so many edibles because of that difficult part made easy. These great little inserts that I used to get from Israel. They would send me these products, and because they're on the leading edge, these little strips to enhance your cannabis. And it was just a playground and stuff. I guess all that innovation's gone because people are just trying to survive.
Well, that's it. I was going to say, all that venture capital that was available in the beginning there, it's gone.
Yeah.
It jumped immediately to like crypto, or some of it was psychedelic mushrooms and stuff. We've got a Supreme Court ruling up here that says that you can actually possess psychedelic mushrooms in Canada if you have a prescription. And so we have a similar gray market in Canada for psychedelic mushrooms, the way that we had for cannabis prior to legalization. Because in Canada, before we fully legalized, we had a Supreme Court ruling that said that you couldn't effectively deny people access to cannabis for medicinal purposes. And that created, what we called the gray market, in which there was a lot of storefronts that opened, and they were kind of breaking the law, but it was such a hard law to enforce that police tended to just say, it's not worth it. And similar things have been happening with psychedelic mushrooms, although to a somewhat lesser extent, because police have been enforcing some of the laws about that. And so you do see raids more so than you did in the weird gray market period of pre-legalization in cannabis. But yeah, it was a wild ride. I was so glad to be there. I'm sure, you were glad to be in the California seat, because that was, California, of course, has the same population as Canada. And, I would always look to California to see, well, what kind of market is there for such and such a product with that population? Because that's probably going to be kind of like Canada. And the only real difference being is that we're federally legal, and that cannabis is regulated nationally through Health Canada, the way that it might be through the Food and Drug Administration in the United States.
Right. I was going to ask about that. So in Canada, it's not just province by province.
No, not at all.
Legal thing, because that's what is so problematic here in the States is half the states.
And
in fact, the province
in California, it varies county to county. There's still places, I think, in California, that counties where it's not legal.
The only thing that the provinces have control over is where and how you can have retail, and where and how you can consume publicly. And I think there's some provinces where you're maybe not able to consume in public. I don't know. I live in Quebec, and you can basically smoke a joint anywhere you can smoke a cigarette. And anybody, Quebec, one thing. Montreal is a completely different thing in Quebec. And anywhere you go in Montreal, anywhere, you smell cannabis. It's always kind of been like that. And ever since legalization, it's a lot more like that. Quebec has very bizarre retrograde cannabis laws, because we have one of the more conservative governments in Canada currently. And when legalization came in, they really, like, for example, you cannot buy sweetened edibles in Quebec because our government thinks that is appealing to children. Even though we have Health Canada has these regulations for cannabis edibles, where you basically need like a blowtorch and a chainsaw to get into the package. And it doesn't look like any other thing. It only looks like a package of cannabis, because I think your logo can be like 1/4 or 1/8 of the surface. And it mostly has to be covered with warnings and, chemical information and stuff. So it's not like, the real concern is always that kids are accidentally going to get into it and eat it. Nobody wants that. Nobody in the industry wants a child to accidentally consume cannabis, or, consume it on purpose. But for some reason, they figure that, they don't, how it is, right? The people who are the most opposed to cannabis often know the least about it. And, we had a minister here who was in charge of the cannabis portfolio in the province of Quebec. The guy's a neuroscientist. He's no dummy. He could just very easily go and read the science, but he chose not to. And so we ended up with a lot of lawmaking that was completely backwards and just simply did not reflect the reality of what science was saying about cannabis. And so, yeah, you can't buy edibles in, well, that's that's not true. You can actually get infused cauliflower in Quebec. And you can get infused cooking oil. You get it. I think you can get some kind of infused garlic thing. But yeah, the gummies that everybody likes, the chocolate stuff. We don't have any of that. And
Can I read you a quote?
absolutely.
Okay. There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S., and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana usage. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. Do you know who I might attribute that quote to?
The name, I'm gonna get the name wrong. It's not Anthony Comstock, is it?
No.
Okay, I'm trying to remember the name of the guy who was the crusader there, the real hard on against cannabis. What was his name?
Harry Anslinger.
Anslinger.
He was the commissioner of the Bureau of Narcotics, and I always feel like one of the unsung figures in sort of making racism in the United States
for sure.
encompass the cannabis thing. And I think that there's a relationship that I haven't quite articulated yet in terms of the closed-mindedness that underlines, a lot of cannabis policy, all that stuff you're talking about with packaging, packaging, when nobody wants kids to smoke weed or have, it's not an aim.
I didn't understand that until I started covering cannabis and following your stuff and the stuff that Alex was covering, because I of course I knew about Anslinger and all the racism in the core. I mean, actually my father taught me about that when I was 12 and caught him with some cannabis, and he had to explain to me, well, first of all, he said, "Son, do you know what a monopoly is?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, the reason cannabis is illegal is because the alcohol industry and tobacco industry wanted to have a monopoly. And the other reason it's illegal is because they're racist." And I was like, "Okay, Dad, sure." But and then you learn the history of it. When I was a college teacher, I used to teach Eric Schlosser's Reefer Madness. So I did know about the history of it, but in the present day, I was totally not on the right wavelength to understand how racially coded cannabis remains in the United States, and how obviously prohibition has always been racially coded and remains so, so long as they're putting Black people in jail for any drugs, honestly. But yeah, I mean, it was a real eye opener to work with folks in the United States and see the extent to which cannabis remains something very tightly connected with race and ethnicity and with American racism in a way that I was quite naive about.
Yeah, we've also on the podcast had some people from our indigenous communities actually back east, and I was hoping you could talk to us about your new focus in
Sure.
You're writing about First Nations people.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm a reporter correspondent for a broadcaster called the Aboriginal People's Television Network in Canada, and I came on. My background before I did Weedweek was I was a magazine reporter for a small magazine serving the Cree First Nation in the north of Quebec. And when I came out of cannabis, I basically went back to covering Indigenous stuff. And for a little while, I was a television producer, but I just really wanted to report. And it's a wild time for cannabis across Indigenous nations in Canada. I mean, so in Canada, we talk about First Nations, which is, I guess, maybe what you call Native people in the United States. We have Inuit in the north, and then, of course, we have Métis, which is a very specific group of people out of the middle of Manitoba, really. That's kind of a mixed European Indigenous ancestry. And we try and cover all that stuff and all the different issues. But the reality is, there's a strong set of laws and Supreme Court decisions in Canada that have given Indigenous people more power than they have in the United States. And that means that the kind of stuff that I do covering First Nations, my area of focus is mainly within the territory of Quebec and Eastern Canada. There's 11 First Peoples in Quebec, I think 43 total nations. And so that keeps me busy, and there's a lot to do there. But I mean, nobody agrees, right? Like, people agree on certain things. Cannabis is not an issue people agree on. And I was mentioning in, the run up to this conversation that I live on the island of Montreal, right next to Montreal, we have two Mohawk reserves. There's Ganawage, and then there's another just a little bit farther. There's an area called Ganastage, which is close to a place called Oka. We had a crisis in 1990 where they called in the army, and there was a shooting war between the Mohawks and the Canadian Army at Ganastage and Oka. And so we have these two Mohawk reserves just off the island of Montreal, and they have very different political histories. Ganastage is complicated place, a lot of people not getting along there, and they don't have a very strong local government. They don't have local peacekeepers or security forces or whatever. And as a result of that, this is a community where we've got all kinds of cannabis shacks. And the way that Indigenous cannabis works in Canada is that you don't need to go through the Health Canada requirements. You don't need to you don't need to get tested and get your product certified by Health Canada. You don't have to irradiate it to make sure that there's no mold growing on it and that sort of thing. You're buying, in essence, off the illicit legacy market the way that you used to do. And you don't necessarily know what you're getting, but it's the same as the old days. And those shacks out of Ganastage are in such enormous numbers that people in the community are just fighting over them, and there's a lot of argument. And then at Ganawage, these are people's cousins just living across the other side of the island. They've got a different political history in recent years. They have a very strong council, and they have a strong peacekeepers force, and they have just simply not legalized cannabis. And so when you go to Ganawage, it's a dry community, so you can't buy alcohol there. But they got smoke shacks. You see a lot of smoke shacks because you can get tax-free. But they have no cannabis. And right now they are in the process of trying to open up cannabis, and they put it into public forums and stuff. And the people are actually very opposed. It's just the number of dispensaries at Ganastage. And we're talking about, these are both within an hour's drive. It's like if I'm trying to think in terms of, because you and I met in Los Angeles, so I was trying to think of this in terms of Los Angeles. If you had one res in Pasadena and one res in Malibu, and they were just doing things completely different ways, same people, same language, but they're just doing things completely differently, right? And so we've got over, across the river from Montreal, you got a res where people just simply do not want legal cannabis at all. They think it's going to be poisonous for their community. And, because really they're looking at the other res and going, we don't want to go that way. That's a huge mess.
Well, I imagine that people from the drive town are going over to cop weed.
Yep. Absolutely. And the same with alcohol, right? And you don't even need to cross the bridge. They're on the South Shore. They just need to leave the res and turn right and go into the next white community. And there's probably a cannabis store there they can go and get their cannabis from. But the attitude in the community is, we're going to control what's happening within our territory. We have, they have this tiny little parcel territory that's left over from, they used to have everything, obviously. And they just don't want that to happen. And I have personal feelings about cannabis. I try not to have opinions about First Nations issues, because everybody always understands that stuff better than I do. I'm an outsider. And so, I would be inclined, maybe if I was sitting down with some of the people that have been opposed to this, to say, well, why are you opposing it exactly? Because I do know some stuff about cannabis. I don't know, necessarily what they're afraid of or what have you. But yeah, it's kind of surprising that there's another Mohawk community in Ontario about 5 hours from here called Tyendinaga. And right now, in the past week, they have, and this is kind of unheard of, it's kind of like calling in the state police. They called in the provincial police to help them get rid of non-Indigenous people growing cannabis on their land. Now, normally, the res does not call in provincial police. That's a no-no. There's Indigenous people have no relationship with provinces in Canada. They have a relationship with the federal government, and generally speaking, they will not acknowledge the authority of provincial. And traditionally, when people bring the provincial police onto the res, it's a bad situation. And so when you see the res, in this case, the community of Tyendinaga, the band council, it's my understanding, basically said, we've got a lot of people who are non-Indigenous who are growing cannabis in our community, and it's gotten a little bit overboard, to the best of my understanding. Tyendinaga was the community that had the most dispensaries back in probably 2018, 2019. And I know some people over there, great people that, and in fact, one of they had a dispensary called Legacy 420 there for a while. I knew a number of the people there. And they were doing really high quality legacy unlicensed cannabis, where they were doing all their own testing, and it was really, really trustworthy stuff. It was just that they were saying, well, we're going to do this outside of the Health Canada regulations about how we're supposed to be selling cannabis. And I'm sure that went for a while, but yeah, it turns out that in a lot of cases, people who wanted to grow cannabis, they're trying to get protection of being on the res, knowing that, well, they're probably not going to call the police, right? Well, it's sort of the way it can go.
It just seems like they'd stand out so much.
Yeah, that's basically it, right? And I mean, it's very similar to, you hear certain companies pejoratively called rent-an Indian companies. If you're in a community that has a law that says, all of your, years ago, I covered a controversy about school buses in the Cree Nation in the north of Quebec, where they wanted to bring school buses in. So they brought in a company that was run by one Native guy and one white guy. And that he got accused of being a rent-an Indian because it's 50% plus one. And then suddenly the next thing you know, you've got white people doing business in your territory. Not everybody's comfortable with that. And it's a similar thing with the cannabis, where, I think a lot of, for a while, there was money in helping non-Indigenous people procure cannabis or grow it. I don't frankly know very much about that end of it, but I think it got kind of out of control as there's been more and more pressure on people growing illicit cannabis in Montreal, the city of Montreal, and around. So I think a lot of people figure it's a safe bet to try and move this onto the res, where you're not going to get as much police scrutiny, until eventually you get the community looking at you and going, well, who the hell are you? What the hell are you doing here?
How are the prices up there? I mean, it sounds like there's a healthy appetite for cannabis up there.
Oh, yeah.
Is there the effort to combat the illicit market? What are taxes like? Can you kind of let us know?
Taxes, I mean, the taxes it's $1 a gram, I think. And that was what we came in with in 2018. And then from there, it depends per province, because every province determines the pricing based on their priorities. Now, I'm in Quebec, where we have, first of all, we don't have private retail. So we only have government retail. And because our government, since like 3 weeks after or 2 weeks after legalization, we elected this conservative government, and they were going to expand this public retail. And then they basically said, well, that's going to cause more people to consume cannabis, theory. And so we're not going to do that. We're actually going to have fewer stores in the hope that fewer people are going to consume cannabis, to mitigate what they refer to as the perverse effects upon society. But they were interested in bringing down the price, because Montreal has always been closely associated with the biker war, and organized crime in Montreal has always been bikers. Not everybody, but people were uneasy about cannabis legalization before it happened, because they remembered the bikers being in control of cannabis, and they didn't love that idea. And so there have been some strange ideas about cannabis in Quebec. But one thing that the government got right is they made the prices really low, and the prices are still fundamentally pretty low. Like, you can get an ounce of pretty decent quality stuff for about $125 tax in, which is not terrible. I mean, buying if you were buying legacy stuff before legalization and you wanted a decent ounce, $150 for a decent ounce was pretty standard before legalization. And obviously we go up to 175, 200, depending, but like $150 would get you a decent ounce. And now, you can get.
I'm right. I'm trying to figure out whether it's Oregon good, or, because California, that's great.
No, that's pretty comparable to what we'd have in Oregon currently with the legal market. But it's funny. I mean, when it was illegal, I think it would be like 300 an ounce.
Really?
Maybe 250, maybe 225 if you knew someone or something. It seemed like it was more. It's definitely way cheaper now than it was.
It's insanely cheap. Yeah.
It's really cheap.
I mean, we had such a glut, I think, prior to legalization, as you know, the way that the aforementioned gray market worked was that a lot of people you could get licensed to grow your own cannabis, or you could get licensed to grow as a proxy. And a lot of people got a really, if I'm going to grow my own cannabis, which I can't legally do in Quebec, I can do that everywhere else in Canada. I can't do that in Quebec. But if I wanted to grow my own, I might not be that good at it, right? There's a lot of secrets and a lot of skullduggery to really growing the perfect bud. And so I might want to ask somebody, like my friend Travis in British Columbia, who's an excellent grower. I might want to get somebody who really knows what he's doing. And you could do that. You could license somebody to grow however many plants you were allowed under what was called the Access to Cannabis for Medical Purposes, ACMP. Yeah. ACMPR. And so prior to legalization, you'd get people, 4 or 5 people would get 100 plants licenses and then give them to somebody to grow for them. And then the next thing you know, you got somebody who's growing hundreds of plants, and you may not need that much. So the rest of that stuff gets channeled into these storefronts that aren't technically legal, but aren't technically illegal either. Exactly. And so that's what, prior to legalization, I think that kept the prices down a lot, was there was so much, federally licensed stuff, and there was so much competition around it that, our prices were getting very, very low on the legacy market before we legalized. I remember thinking at first, well, I'm not going to spend $200 on an ounce of government weed that's really weirdly cured and dry and crunchy, when I could just go online and spend $150 for something really exquisite. Not that I would or anything. I'm not saying I ever committed a crime of any kind, but
you're the first person, I think it was like 2018, I ever heard use the word mid. Now, was that? I've never gotten clarification. I've never dug it up. Is it originally a Canadian slang, or was it a weed?
Oh, that's a weed thing, as far as I know. I only ever heard mid with reference to we would talk about quads and trips, and then mids. So when you're selling, because a lot of what was being sold was being sold online prior to legalization. There was this thing called the MOMs, the mail order marijuana shops, and you could just basically Google and go up online and send some random stranger your money online and hope that they would send you some cannabis. And the way that you would go online, and also this also worked for wholesale, when people who, I was just talking about these licensed growers who were growing an enormous amount of stuff, and then they had, maybe they wanted to try and sell it to dispensaries. Maybe you had 10 pounds or something. Well, they'd go on these wholesale markets, and people then tried online to describe cannabis quality. Well, you can't squeeze it, you can't smell it, you can't really get a good look at it. So they made up this system where, AAA was the original thing, and there was 4As, and that became known as trips and quads. And then a step down from that was mid. And then I think everything below that was swag, or like dirt. And yeah, I mean, mids were, just sort of what you get from your local guy in like rural New Brunswick. So someone who didn't necessarily have a strong connection, but he'd been growing something in his shed.
Well, listen, this is the deal. I feel like we haven't clarified it. I feel like it could very well be a Cannabis Canada connection rather than.
Yeah, absolutely.
I didn't get rid of that. I just haven't heard of this stuff. Did you?
Canaticus?
Does any of this stuff sound familiar?
No, but I think it's really peculiar too, though. The ordering it online, is that like the dark web? Is that just using VPNs?
It was the open web. You just basically type in order Cannabis Canada, and you'd get a dozen websites, and you'd choose the one you knew. You choose the one maybe you heard of, and you'd go online, And there'll always be an FAQ, and they wouldn't tell you whether or not this was illegal, because it was illegal. But yeah, I mean, they were just open like that because, well, what are they going to do, really? In a couple of places they got shut down, but in most cases, people figured, well, you're going to get a huge ticket, but if we sell enough of this stuff before we get the huge ticket and they shut us down, then we're going to be fine. We'll balance out. And I never really understood how that worked. I mean, we had, I don't know if you remember this in the summer of 2018. You might not even have, actually, it might have been the summer of 2019. No, I'm pretty sure it was the summer of 2018. Do you remember the cement blocks in Toronto?
I do not.
Okay.
I don't
Well,
remember Rob Ford, so hey.
There was a dispensary in Toronto called Cafe, C-A-F-E. And once they started raiding the dispensaries in Toronto, the dispensaries started shutting down. That would be the thing. You'd raid a dispensary once, they'd reopen, raid it again, they'd reopen a little slower, raid it a third time. They're like, all right, screw it. Cafe did not feel that way about being raided. And so they just kept reopening no matter what. They would get raided and they would reopen. They'd get raided and they would reopen. So eventually the Toronto police, they had 2 or 3 locations. And the Toronto police attempted to prevent them from reopening by carting in cement blocks and stacking them up in front of the door in order to prevent the door from being open. Now, the first time they did this, they surprised somebody who lived upstairs and could no longer leave the building. And I think the first time they did it, some activists somehow procured like a backhoe and arrived in the dead of night and carted the cement blocks down the street. And the next thing you know, they were opening it the next morning, right? So, and I always wondered, like, I wonder if these folks are going to be up for any kind of serious charge, or like, are they just skating, on the premise that they're just going to get a huge, huge fine and they'll be able to pay it if they keep just selling this stuff? I don't know. I mean, there was some interesting reporting about the folks who were behind that organization. I'm not going to say a damn thing about any of them. But I don't know. I don't even know if that stuff was true. It just seemed that they were intrepid and they were not troubled by a series of cement blocks.
I want to talk to you for this last portion about U.S. Canadian relations.
Oh yes.
And the mid thing it brought up because I still feel like it might have been y'all who came up with it. But I feel like there's always been a cultural exchange. I don't know if you remember, but I grew up on Lake Erie. I grew up in Sandusky, Ohio, and and I listen to Canadian radio. I definitely feel like there's been a cultural exchange. I don't know if it's on par with Mexico, but it's a serious cultural exchange. I haven't talked to any Canadians since Trump took over, since January 20th, as we like to call that Holocaust Day. What are things like for you all up here, or up there toward us down here?
I mean, I saw a story, I think it was on Friday or on Thursday, saying that American liquor sales have gone down by 85% in Canada since Trump took office. And that's kind of what's the term for that? A synecdoche or metonymy or something. It represents the greater the greater Canadian feeling, I think, that I'm not sure if there's a we, but people in Canada overall, like, a lot of the divisions that take place within Canada, Indigenous people versus settlers, French people versus English, even people who are opposed to immigration and stuff like that. I think a lot of those people kind of came together when the stuff with Trump started, just simply because, like, a lot of people are genuinely concerned that he's making eyes at the possibility of an invasion. And I don't think we can really joke about that too much. It's really not clear what that guy is up to. And he keeps making these statements that appear to be threats to Canadian sovereignty. And I think everybody's a little puzzled by that. Nobody's really thrilled about that. But it's also like, the guy's such a profound bullshitter that you really don't know whether to take anything he says seriously. I've personally found it very comforting to be working in Indigenous media where virtually nobody cares about Trump, because all of their problems tend to be on a very different scale. and it's very much connected with the land, and I find that very comforting. But it also allowed me to kind of pull away from paying attention to the whole Trump thing, because I don't know what the hell I can do about any of it, right? If this guy decides he's going to invade, well, there's not much I can really do to change that. But it's just been strange to. There's always a kind of a simmering anti-Americanism among Canadians, but overall, it's not. I wouldn't say it's very serious, right? Like, normally you'd meet an American and you wouldn't presume anything about them. Now you kind of want to know, like, particularly you're looking at like a, white guy in his mid 60s with a beard or a goatee. You really want to know where that guy was January 6th, right? Like, you meet an American and you're like, so you're fond of your leader there? Because there's a general consensus. He's not liked in Canada. Nobody really likes Trump. There's always going to be a weird minority of people, but I think he could have been a good deal more popular with Canadians had he not threatened to invade us.
Yeah, absolutely. Even he's a Rob Fordian type without the drugs. Just that brashness that I think North American white people really respond to. Maybe not just white people.
Who's Rob Ford? Was he the Toronto mayor?
Yeah,
he died.
And his
right?
brother's in charge. His brother's in charge in Ontario. He runs the province of Ontario. And he, in fact, said when Trump started talking about this 51st state stuff, he came out and said, I would have voted for the guy. I like the guy. And now he's doing this. I can't believe he did this.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of people who voted for Doug Ford. People in my province who voted for François Legault and the Coalition Avenir Québec, which is a very conservative party. I think a lot of those people saw something they liked in Trump up until he started talking about, like, maybe coming up and taking our water. Because that's the thing that people are afraid of, is that he's going to come after our natural resources. And, I don't think that's something that reflects necessarily very much on Americans. I don't think most Americans want that at all. So it's this really strange situation of, like, more so than ever, I don't think that, people conflate Americans with their leader up here. Now, that could just be me. But, I know, I meet Americans up here and they always seem quite chastened about what's going on down there. And we're all very concerned about you all because, like, we live upstairs, right? And if your guys' house catches fire, we go too. Yeah. So it's a concern.
It's a little bit extreme in analysis or in comparison, but in my head, it's happening. I'm starting to conflate Americans who let this Trump shit happen, let the invasions of cities happen, with Israelis who don't necessarily support what's going on in Gaza, because we've had this great deal now. But they're kind of letting it happen. I've got a really good friend from cannabis who's having an amazing time there, and I hate to subtweet anybody, but I just feel like, because I'll never sub-X anybody, I'll only subtweet. I feel like I adore this person less because this person is having such a great time in Israel. What's going on there? Is that wrong? Is it wrong for me to feel that?
Why you look at me?
I want to hear what you think too.
Yeah, the comfort level of people with violence.
Yeah.
It's kind of disturbing at times, in any sort of political situation. Especially, I feel like to sidetrack, the whole, like, peace plan thing, it's like, well, of course the Palestinians agreed to this because they're basically have been devastated. They don't really have much of a choice. And now it's just I think Gaza's just gonna become, Saudi Arabian, Qatari, Israeli, European, and those people are just going to be eventually forced out. 20 years from now, I don't know if there's going to be any Palestinians in Palestine. But we can move on to something else.
No, do you, what point would it be reasonable for you to start making those comparisons? Because you're forgiving now because the shit hasn't dropped yet. But when they come after your water, you're gonna be like, you fucking bystanders down there. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I can't speak with any authority about Gaza or Palestine. I have my feelings and stuff, but I don't. But I think, look, I think people are uneasy and they're watching carefully, because it could go so many different ways. It could go nowhere at all, right? It could be that, and I say that from a Canadian perspective because obviously something is certainly happening in the United States that is genuinely terrifying. And so we can only say, okay, well, we've got this border and we're somehow protected from that, provided we don't elect anybody like that. But, we are, I think, probably watching and going, somebody had better do something down there. It looks quite bad. And I keep noticing, people who are traditional members of the Republican Party saying things like, if we don't prosecute Trump soon, we're not going to have a democracy anymore. And I think to myself, the Republicans are not necessarily famous for opposing Republicans. So to hear people, I was trying to, like Bill Kristol, I think, said that recently. And I thought, oh boy, that's not a good situation for the United States to be in. Although it seems fairly abundantly clear that it's been like that for a little while now.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite story that you've worked on since you've gone back to the Indigenous issues?
Do I have a favorite story? I do, but it's not like a fun story. It's more of a story about the fact that, like, Canada has a lot of treaties, and unlike the United States, we're actually legally held. We're bound to our treaties. And one of the things that's been happening in Canada since 1975 is that we've been adopting modern treaties in different areas. And so currently, if you look, oh my God, I think I might, if I can just reach behind that thing here, I happen to have a treaty map of Canada. I didn't mean to, but so you can see, this is Canada, and the gray areas are the areas with no treaties. You notice that on both coasts of Canada, we have no treaties. And in both of those areas, particularly on the West Coast, they have been developing modern treaties a lot lately, and they've had some really profound victories for First Peoples. And in the past few months in Quebec, there was this massive fight over an attempted new law about forestry. And suddenly we got all of these First Peoples, First Nations specifically, who were joining together to create alliances that hadn't previously existed in this particular area where there's no treaty. And my thinking watching this happen was, the first modern treaty in Quebec started very much the same way, or in Canada rather. It happened in Quebec with the Crees, and it made them a lot of money. Now, it cost them a river, which is a hell of a loss, and it cost them a lot of land that ended up under the water because they had to accept a dam under duress. But the Cree Nation became quite wealthy as a result of that. So I covered a lot of this stuff around what was called Bill 97, this forestry bill in Quebec that was bringing all of these people together, suddenly talking about Indigenous issues in a way I'd never heard people in Quebec talk about it before, including non-Indigenous people. We started having protests about forestry in the north down in Montreal. I've never seen that before, that people were demonstrating on behalf of Indigenous people down in Montreal. And so that was a really exciting story for me to cover. And ultimately, the Indigenous opposition was so fervent that it got the bill torpedoed. The premier just decided, all right, this is not going to go forward. There's too much anger, too much opposition. And he finally pulled the bill about 3 weeks ago. And I followed that all summer. And I kept thinking to myself, well, where is this going to go? I mean, maybe it's not going to go anywhere. And it's not clear that it is going to go anywhere. But it has the makings of the possibility of another treaty in one of the two areas of Canada where we don't currently have treaties. And so to me, that's really exciting. I mean, that's kind of, it's wonky shit. I'll acknowledge that. But at the same time, it's, you're talking about people getting a greater say of power over their territory, greater recognition of their ancestral territory. And, ideally people are able to get some sort of an economic relationship with the state that allows them to have stronger and more stable institutions in their communities. And I think that's really worthwhile. I mean, I get excited about that stuff. It's not, I wish I had a really sleazy story. Well, there was the,
No, but I ask you one question before I want to hear the sleazy story. I know Donnell wants to hear the sleazy story. Is somebody listening to this that might not be, so as well knowledgeable as you on, the First Nations, their political power in Canada. which, hearing you talk is much greater than indigenous
yeah.
people will have here in America. And are they like a higher percentage of the population in Canada? Have they just historically been, I mean, you were saying how like Canada has actually observed their treaties, whereas we haven't necessarily.
Yeah.
But is it just a much bigger percentage of the population there? Is that kind of just the basis of their power?
I think it is. It's been a while since I compared the percentage of the population, Indigenous folks in the United States and Canada. One of the things that Canada did not do was the sort of wounded knee approach. We didn't have massacres in the same way. What Canadians attempted to do, the form of genocide we took was assimilation, starvation, malnourishment in what was called the residential school system, which was really sort of a re-education kind of, the famous statement associated with it is the residential school system was designed to kill the Indian and the child. And so what we ended up with was a lot of people with a lot of problems, a lot of people who had been taken away and interned in this system where there was widespread physical abuse. And when you tell adults in charge of children that these children are somewhat less human than other children because they're Indigenous, that leads to an awful lot of sexual abuse as well. So we've got a lot of people with a lot of problems who came out of this system. The system wasn't designed to kill them. They were designed to survive. They were just supposed to be assimilated, and they came out in a lot of pain, but also in a lot more numbers, I think, than you have in the United States, because our goal was not to kill everybody off. And I don't know how much that happened in the United States, but it seemed like it was a pretty well, it's not so much a prominent feature. It's just something you notice about the way the United States handled its relations with First Peoples. And as a consequence of that, I think there is more people up here, more Indigenous people as a percentage of the population. But also, a huge thing is our Supreme Court is not nearly as politicized as the United States. And so they frequently make these judgments about Indigenous issues that give power to Indigenous people because they require the government to follow the laws that it set out for itself. And in many cases, it's breached those laws when it comes to certain relations with certain peoples at certain times. So, you see these judgments that result in major shifts in the way that we conceive of Indigenous territory. And, the Supreme Court every once in a while will come down with a judgment and you'll say, oh, okay, so I guess technically, there was a judgment that took place in the late 90s that suggested that, okay, well, people who are on reserve, yeah, that's their territory, but their ancestral territory outside the reserve remains their title if they didn't sign it away in a treaty. So you still have title to that. And that's really fascinating. I mean, one of our treaties that is the Peace and Friendship Treaties from the 1750s that they cover New Brunswick in that area. The Supreme Court has effectively said, well, the Peace and Friendship Treaties kind of seem like all of New Brunswick belongs to the Native people. They don't really seem to have given any of the land to the Canadians. Good luck with that. So, and this is the thing is that, we do have to follow the rule of law and such. And our Supreme Court tends to make decisions that, they don't really, it doesn't matter if a community is very, very small. The court will tend to decide on the basis of precedent and what is right, rather than, in Montreal, in Quebec, the Crees originally, the first treaty that they ended up with, they were kind of forced into it because a judge said that we can't have 2,000 Indians holding up the progress and development of a province of 5 million people. And that sort of decision at a Supreme Court level doesn't usually happen anymore. That happened at the level of Quebec courts, and they knew if they fought it during the time that they were fighting it, they'd lost their injunctions. They were gonna lose their river no matter what. So they decided they were gonna settle, and that led to that. But overall, and generally speaking, court decisions have to be have to follow the law here in a way that they don't seem to in the United States as often.
It's a very novel idea.
It's funny, eh?
It's crazy. But I want to ask before we go, because we got to bounce.
Absolutely.
It is Canadian Thanksgiving this afternoon. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
How are you spending? How do people in general acknowledge that holiday, celebrate that holiday?
It's not that big of a deal. It's certainly not American Thanksgiving. Like people don't fly for Canadian Thanksgiving. If you're within a couple of hours of your family, you might go drive there. I didn't this weekend. My family's not doing anything in particular. I'm just basically sticking around home watching the Blue Jays. They lost to the Mariners last night. It was painful.
That's right.
Sorry about that. I imagine you guys are probably not cheering for the same guys as I am, but
No, this is about
Yeah, I was gonna say it looks like
we were at a Blazers game when the extra inning game came across, and people were as excited here as they seemed excited to see the Mariners. You're good Mariners fans, right?
there are Mariners fans here. Yes.
Short drive. Anyway, what are you gonna say?
That's basically it. I mean, I'm taking it very easy. It's not like, especially in Quebec, Thanksgiving is not kind of a thing.
Right.
It's an English Canada thing more than it is a French speaking Canada thing. We still get the day off, which is cool. And, a lot of the time, like personally, because I come from an English family, so I will often go and, eat a meal with my mom's family. If we're just not doing that this year, my uncle had an issue and stuff going around, but it's a very simple, like it's a very quiet situation. We take Christmas pretty seriously, and I think the way probably Americans do with their Thanksgiving, with your Thanksgiving, that's when people are going to fly across the country to be with their family and what have you. And but yeah, Thanksgiving is kind of just I don't know, it's a mild family dinner. It's a nice thing to do, if you can do it. Have some turkey and potatoes and gravy and whatnot, but like it's not a big festival or anything. It's pretty chill. So it's an opportunity to eat well, and that's about it. I mean, we don't even usually have a big sports event on the same day.
Right. Not even among the First Nations, they're not celebrating.
You know what? I've seen a couple of my friends. I saw some friends over in Ganawage, Mohawk friends. Were doing their first Thanksgiving. They were just trying, I think. And a couple of other people that celebrated, just because it's a nice opportunity. You got the weekend off. It's a long weekend. Why not have some people over and make some food? Pretty good idea. No, whether you see it as Thanksgiving or not.
Yeah.
But
you
no,
can't go wrong with guests at the house. Before I go, anything you wish that I'd asked you that I haven't asked you?
Not even. I am honestly, yeah. I'm just afraid I'm talking about this stuff in a way that's like, I don't know, too nerdy and too off in one direction or something. I'm not covering the stuff that people are going to be interested in. I wanted to tell you a sleazy story, and this story made the news. So I'm from Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada. We were in Ottawa last year for the Special Chiefs Assembly of the Assembly of First Nations. Assembly of First Nations brings together all of the elected chiefs under the Indian Act in Canada. Not going to get into hereditary chiefs. That's a whole other thing. Elected chiefs is one thing. So all of the chiefs were in Ottawa to debate a few, and we're talking about hundreds, like maybe 500, 600 chiefs all in big room. And the discussions are brutal. Sometimes, they can get into really heavy stuff, really, really miserable subjects. They can often be very angry. People are, what have you. And it can be pretty stressful. And on the first day, I was up there with one of our cameramen who knew the town very well. And I'm from there. And exactly at 5:00, the bell rings, everybody stands up and goes. And I turned to the cameraman, Jeff, and I named the famous local strip club. And I said, off they go to Fairfax. And Jeff said to me, that's a lot truer than you realize. I said, no, I'm from Ottawa. I think it's true. And we sort of chortled about it or what have you. Anyway, next morning we're coming in and we all get this email, an anonymous email forwarded to us from the APTN headquarters in Winnipeg saying, does anybody know if it's true whether Chief Jerry Daniels of the Southern Chiefs Organization of Manitoba got beat up out front of Fairfax last night? And it turns out this is a guy who is the leader of an organization of many chiefs in Manitoba. That it's a very powerful organization. And this dude somehow got into a drunken fight at Fairfax. And then it later came out that it was members, it was council members and possibly chiefs, or maybe just council members of nations who are part of his organization that he somehow got into it with at Fairfax. and they put him in the hospital. Not very badly, I hope. But it was super. Well, it was just a pretty dramatic thing to have happen in the middle of the Special Chiefs Assembly of the AFN. And it happened right there at Fairfax, like Jeff and I predicted. So that's my sleazy story.
I have to add, it is Fairfax, FACTS, not FAX, like Fairfax or.
No, it was Fairfax, FAX, Fairfax.
Well, I'm glad you went out on that note.
I wanted to get something.
No.
You know?
Okay. Hey, man, you got to come back. I'm glad to see you after all these years.
Oh, it's such a pleasure, and nice to meet you, Lev, and nice to see you, Donnie. I've said many times, you are my editorial Yoda. I have handed your advice to several younger journalists, even as I can't take it myself. Not the writers make choices. Your job, your number one job as a writer is to make the choice. You can't hand that to your editor. You need to make it yourself. That is hard advice to take that you gave me in the taxi on the way to LAX. And I've thought about it for 7 years, and I allowed it to make me a better writer. And I've handed it off to at least 2 younger reporters and I always say that this one goes to Donnell Alexander, one of the most important journalists in my life, as far as, because Lev, this is ridiculous, but when Donnie came in at Weedweek, I was already a fan of his. I knew his stuff from KCRW because I listened to podcasts and stuff, and I couldn't believe, I was like nervous to meet Donnie, and I was like, oh, the guy Green Goblins is going to come and pick me up at Alex's house, and we're taking a cab to the airport. This is wild, man. I was so stoked. And we had this great conversation about editing, and it really, it has stayed with me for many years. So thank you, Donnie.
We usually cut this stuff out when I get to the edit. But
you can cut it if you like. But, it's the truth.
We had fun, man. And you introduced Mid into my life, and so I can just diss people offhand. All right, man, we got to go. We'll talk to you later.
All right, you folks take care of yourselves, and for fuck's sake, stay safe down there.
Oh, thanks. You didn't even talk about Portland. My goodness.
Good God.
All right, man.